right. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to 8 Days of Diana Wynne Jones with your hosts. I'm Emily Tesh.
And I'm Rebecca Fremow, and today we're going to be talking about Cart and Cwidder.
All right. So, Cart and Cwidder, we're into the mid 1970s now. This is the fourth book she's published?
Yes. And we are in the first book that she's written that is full high fantasy, not set in our world at all, which is a really interesting move for a couple of reasons.
First of all, Diana Wynne Jones doesn't do full high fantasy, and in fact, apart from the Walemark Quartet, these four books, I don't think she ever does it again.
No, I don't think so. Everything else, there's always a link back to our world. We're looking forward, which we're not supposed to do. Everything she's done up to this point, since we're looking backwards, has been about the incursions of recognizable myth into the lives of ordinary kids who are just kind of going around doing ordinary kid things. I think that more of the kids in this book do feel more or less like quite ordinary kids. And they are also dealing with the incursions of myths that are recognizable to them into their daily lives, which is one of the things that I really want to talk about, is the way that she kind of uses her same toolbox in this different space. But they are very much in a different high fantasy world, and she's pulling on, it feels like she's pulling much more on things that she's kind of learned from other fantasists, like Tolkien, who we know that she was learning to and listening to very literally.
Yeah, so this is definitely, to me, Dalemark feels like it's in conversation with Tolkien. Maybe not so much Lord of the Rings, but The Hobbit, but also with Tolkien's love of language. So much of the world in this book is about names and places, and you can tell she's actually done a little bit of conlanging. She doesn't go into detail on it, but things like the hero's name is Tanamoril, Moral for short, and we are told that the Moril part is a diminutive of Tanamil, who's one of these mythical figures from earlier on. If, like me, you went through and you read the very high fantasy thing, which is the glossary at the back.
Absolutely.
Never in any other Diana Wynne Jones, only in the Dalemark Quartet. But also things like... Go on, you first.
They only get that in some editions. My copy of this book, which I've had since, let's see, when was this published? This was published in 1995. There's no glossary, and I don't remember getting a glossary until I read Crown of Dalemark.
Interesting. So it might have been something that was put back in or added in to make it more high fantasy later on.
Yeah, I think that's really possible.
Motion has the glossary, it has the map. Like, as a book, it's being packaged as a high fantasy.
I do have a map.
But also in terms of being post Tolkien, it's the influence of Anglo-Saxon. Diana Wynne Jones read English at Oxford. She's done her old English, and in this one it shows.
Yes, I'm so glad we have you on the podcast to talk about that, because you can have a bunch of things that I would not have noticed, and in fact had never noticed in all my years of reading these books.
I mean, I'm not very good. My old English is very much amateur, self-taught, but I did sort of pick up some of the poetry. She is... let's talk about what the book is about. The book is about...
Sorry.
We keep forgetting to do this. We're like, let's just get going. Okay. The book, Cart and Cwidder, which is, by the way, a terrible title. It does what it says on the tin. There are three children, eventually a fourth. They live in a travelling cart with their father, Clennon the singer, and their mother, Lenina. And the cart travels from South Dalemark to North Dalemark and back again, and in the towns along the way, the cart stops and they give musical performances. And they share local news, and they pass on messages, and they're clearly sort of a necessary part of the functioning of communication in this society.
And the South and the North are in some kind of conflict, which Moral, our POV character, certainly doesn't know very much about or know the origins of. And as far as he can tell, when he asks about the origins of it, his father doesn't really give him a specific description. It's all kind of lost in the sands of time. but people
there was a king, and then there was not a king, and now there's a conflict, not an open war. And in fact, part of this story is about preventing an open war between North and South Dalemark. But a conflict, certainly of culture, and that comes through really clearly that the South and the North have very different feels as places to be. And a conflict as well of, I suppose, belief society. The South Dalemark comes across as prosperous and mercantile, but also cold and unfriendly. The North is green and beautiful in all the descriptions we hear of it. We don't actually see very much of North Dalemark. It seems to be almost a place that exists in the main character Moral's mind more than it is a place that is real. And we'll come back to that, this idea of the mind place. But two very different societies, which at the same time are the same society. They're not different countries. They're the two parts of Dalemark. They have a shared
speak the same language with some differences.
Yes.
Some orthographic differences specifically, which is really fun. As we know, when we get another kid, the fourth kid arrives, who's going to join them for the trip up north. His name is Kialan, spelled with a K. In the south, it would be spelled with a C. And Moral does not like him. He's annoying, he's stuck up, he doesn't want to do work around the cart. He seems to be sort of vaguely judging them all of the time. And this is the largest problem in Moral's life until abruptly much larger problems arise.
Right. So what becomes clear as the book goes on is that Clennon the singer, Moral's father, is not just a musician, a performer. He is the chief spy for the North, the porter, and his business in the South, as well as singing and performing. He is passing messages between revolutionaries. He is transporting refugees, and Kialan is one such refugee, an escaped valuable hostage, trying to return home to his father, who is one of the most powerful earls in the North.
But none of this becomes clear to Moral until after his father has been murdered by unknown men in the woods. And immediately upon his father being murdered, Moral has no idea why this is happening, and also no sense that anything is going to be able to be done about it. I think there's this really great and awful line where Moral is thinking about the fact that none of them are assuming that anything is going to be able to be done about it. And he says, they should be angry. Clennon had been murdered. They should be trying to bring the murderers to justice. But none of them thought of it. It was out of question here in the South. The 6 men had been far too well dressed. So they know that somebody powerful has killed their father. And immediately after this, their mother, Lenina, is like, all right, I know how we're going to fix this situation. And turns and drives around to the house of her old flame, the man to whom she was once betrothed, who is in fact an Earl of the South, and is like, right, all right, I was born into high position here in the South. I'm going to marry this man, and we're all going to be set. We're going to stay here in this earldom, and you're going to grow up to your birthright, which is to be upper-class children of the South. And we'll get Kialan home somehow.
Right. So there's this sort of abrupt turn quite early in the book with the sudden murder of Clennon, and what Moral certainly sees as the betrayal of his mother. Like, Moral's personal loyalties, his feelings are for North Dalemark, for the North. And so the children decide to go on without her, without either parent. They are going to go north by themselves and take Kialan north.
Now,
any help?
Yes. And with Kialan sort of posing as their fourth sibling, one of the things, before we get into some of the more serious stuff in this book, which is a very serious book, I think in every previous recording that we've done, we've sort of stopped as we're talking about these awful things that are happening to these kids and being like, this book is really funny, though. It's really funny. You should read it.
This one's not that funny.
It's not that funny. I love this book. I love Dalemark. When I first read it at like age 9 or 10, I didn't like it very much at all because it wasn't funny. And it took me coming back to it a couple of years later to actually, when I learned to appreciate that not all books had to be funny, to really start loving Dalemark, which now I do deeply. But one thing that I do think is kind of funny is, and I think this is a book where our our style of looking back is going to come in really useful in a couple of ways. It's a really interesting reframing of the Ogre Downstairs problem novel about what to do when you find out that your parents don't get along and suddenly you have new siblings.
Right. It's again like it's a story about your adults in your life are making a lot of choices without you, and you are just stuck
Turns out your mother
dealing with
wasn't
that.
happy with your father. Your mother has a new husband. You immediately hate him because he's your mother's new husband, but actually he's fine. Lenina's new husband is completely fine. He's nice. He's sort of a fusspot. And also you have a new step sibling, and you immediately hate them because they're new and in your life and you don't get on, you don't understand each other. But then you have to be in cahoots with each other in dangerous situations, and it turns out that when your life more or less depends on them, they're sort of all right.
I think cahoots is actually, for the first time, not the word I would choose for the situation that they're in, because cahoots to me says comedy, and this is all very life and death and not comedy.
There is a version of this book that's comedic about four kids who have to desperately, perform, attempt to put on a show across the entirety of South Dalemark. But it's not funny, you're right. It's, first of all, every show that they put on after they leave their mother behind is very intensely about their grief and loss for their father, who was the person who held the whole show together, was a larger-than-life performer. And these are all children under the age of 15. They are not larger than life. They are much smaller than life. And they're using, the one thing that they've got going for them is their grief. They get out there and they say, we can't do what our father did. He was murdered. And people give them money because they feel sorry for them.
Absolutely. And in fact, it's interesting. So we've got three siblings, all of whom have great big long names because Clennon says he likes a big name. But they're known by their nicknames of Moral, the protagonist, who's the youngest son, 11 years old, his older sister Brid, who's about 13, and Dagna,
yes.
Who's about 15. And it is Brid who is the performer, who in some ways is the most like Clennon, who is the one who uses her very real grief to manipulate crowds, to make a profit, to get them the money they need to buy food to go to the next town. And Moral thinks about that at one point. Let me grab the quote. Moral could see she was trying not to cry, but he could also see she was making it plain to the crowd that she was trying not to cry. He marvelled at the way she could use real feelings for what was, in fact, a show. And
yes.
That is a concept that comes back because that, as Moral thinks more and learns more about his father's sort of second secret self as a spy, he becomes more and more aware that everything about his father was a performance, a show, and that there was a reality in there somewhere. Clennon clearly cared very much about his cause, but the reality and unreality kept feeding back into each other.
Yeah, this is also, so there's a lot in this book about parents and children and what you get from your parents, how that's sort of distributed and refracted into the personalities of the children. This is the first book, by the way, which I think is really interesting. Diana Wynne Jones is really interested in parentified children. Everything that she's written previous to this is about kind of when we have multiple siblings or multiple kids in a group. It's the oldest child that we're following, or the child who's sort of most taking care of the younger children. And here, for the first time, she's writing from the point of view of the youngest child, the child who doesn't expect to be in charge, who's, kind of happy to sit back and let the older kids take charge until they can't. So the kid who's actually first stepping up is the oldest, Dagner, who is trying really, really hard to follow in his father's footsteps and lead the group and make decisions. And he makes a mess of it, and then he can't anymore because he's arrested and Moral loses him.
Right, and in fact they take it in turns to try and step into Clennon's shoes. So Dagner tries to pass information about a betrayal going on and manages to pass it to the person betraying the Revolutionary Network and immediately gets arrested. And it's a capital offence. He's going to be hanged. He's 15 years old. He's going to die. And then Brid steps up and is in that very Diana Wynne Jones way of the female sibling. She goes, right, I'm mother. She does the motherly thing. She looks after the food. She sorts out the plan. She tries to order Moral around. But Brid in turn actually fails. And it does eventually fall to Moral to solve their problems.
Yeah.
with the aid of the Cwidder, which is the other half of this title. So, one, they are children in a cart, and they have with them musical instruments called Cwidders, and in particular, the bass Cwidder, the large Cwidder, which was Clennan's and which passes to Morrill on Clennan's death. And a Cwidder appears to be effectively a cello.
Right. They also have hand organs. They also, they have instruments that we would recognize. The Cwidder, I think, is a Cwidder so that we can tell it's a fantasy instrument that does fantasy things. Because this Cwidder is, of course, or at least the big Cwidder that Morrill inherits, is, of course, magical.
I do wonder if, as well, it's a little bit of a language choice, a world-building choice, because cello, of course, a violoncello is an Italian word, which I think would stand out a little bit in Dalemark, which is very intentional about how it uses language.
That's true, and I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of what where the word organ comes from, because that's going to take us way down
that one doesn't stand out as much in an English context, I think. Yeah. Whereas cello, to me, definitely sounds like a loan word.
Definitely.
But yeah, that brings me back to actually Jones's sort of use of Old English, of Anglo-Saxon. Of course, the dead giveaway is the name of the world, Dalemark. The Dales, obviously, are the Dales.
Right.
There's the Earls of the North Dales and the South Dales, and this is this word for a valley, for a green place. But this central word, mark, that is Old English, Anglo-Saxon, mark, border, division, boundary. As in the marches, the Welsh marches, which are the border between England and Wales, and which has lots of picturesque castles because it was historically a site of lots and lots of conflict.
Which is, so I guess that brings us back to the signifiers of the whole overall sort of political spectrum of Dalemark. It's funny, when you were looking at the list of books that we had to look at for this season, I think we said this before, the first thing you said was, oh, look at all these books about the Troubles. Because Dalemark, of course, has a north and a south. This is something that I never thought of reading it when I was a kid, because as an American child, we have a very different context for a divided north and a south.
You can actually use both the Northern Ireland lens and the American lens to examine this book. So, give us an American take on North and South Dalemark. How did it read to you?
So, North, very, very directly from the beginning, we're told that the North is free and the South is not free. We have this cart that's smuggling a child who is specifically brown. Cialan is described as having a very brown complexion, that's the word that she uses, which is typical of North Dalemark and not typical of South Dalemark. He's also blonde and blue-eyed, so I think that, there's ambiguity and sort of, it's not a very, direct sort of racial picture the way that it might be if it was a modern book. But there is a distinct physical difference between these kids, although not so much of one that they can't pass Cialan off as their very tan sibling when they're running around. Anyway, they're smuggling him up north, and there's a ton of imagery in the words and the music that's been used to talk about freedom and revolution in the South. Very early on in the book, Dagner, who's the sibling that he's the most creative sibling in a way. He's the sibling that composes. And he sings a song about a blackbird singing for freedom and how nice it is to walk in the woods and be free. I should have grabbed this quote, and I don't have it for the exact lyrics of Dagner's song, but Clennan says, you can't sing like that. You can't sing that here in the South. Oh, right, it's come with me, the blackbird asks you, follow me. And Clennan says you can't say that because that is exactly an echo of the freedom songs that people would use in the South. They never dared say a thing straight out, so it was all put sideways. Follow the Lark was one, Free as Air in Secret another one, and the best known was Come Up the Dale with Me. And the Lords here still hang a man on the spot for singing words like that. And to me, again, 12 years old, that seemed very directly an echo of the way that music and coded music was used for the Underground Railroad here in, the American context, the American Civil War.
And of course, this is an underground railroad. Specifically what they are doing is transporting someone who is escaping from a horrendous situation in the South. What becomes clear is that Cialan and his older brother Conan were shipwrecked in a southern port, immediately captured, and because they were such high-value political prisoners, the older brother Conan was killed, hanged in front of Cialan, and Cialan was only spared because he's 14, which is just a year too young to be tried as an adult. So Cialan actually, from the first time we meet him, when Moral finds him very, very annoying, he is deeply sunk in grief, which becomes clear as we go on. We'll come back to that. Thinking about then these lenses, so you can talk about the American lens, and I think it's a really true reading, honestly. I think that's got to be in there as well in the inspiration for Walemark. But for me, coming from an Irish family, I did look at this book and go, oh, that is about Ireland. That is about a country divided between one half which is free and one half which is marked by whispers, arrests, people being unjustly arrested. Remember, again, this is the 1970s. This is the age of internment in Northern Ireland of political prisoners and suspected members of the IRA. This, to me, it felt like it was a book influenced by the struggle in Northern Ireland.
And it's also, I mean, she's just come off writing Dog's Body as the other thing. And she's so interested in this book, like the sequence where Dagner is arrested, and we start thinking about jails and prisons, and Moral is experiencing what it's like to be inside a prison, and how people sort of change as soon as whether or not they're guilty or innocent, as soon as they're suspected of a crime.
Right.
There's a really harrowing
the abuse of political prisoners is deeply in this book, and so is actually the experience of my father has been killed because he is a suspected agent for the other side. So Clennon and Kathleen's father in Dog's Body share this trait of dead dad ? Terrorist.
And both of them, as soon as they experience this loss, and then find themselves acting out really dramatically in ways they wouldn't otherwise do. I actually didn't see this until I was looking at Farah Mendelssohn's book, who pulls out the quote, the moment that Kathleen, when she finds out her father's dead, and she immediately goes into her awful guardian mother's studio and starts smashing plates, does acts of, incredible violence that she hadn't been able to bring herself to do before, and then runs away. And Moral, when he's pushed to the last straw, also does an act of incredible violence.
Right, it's that moment when a child pushed past their limits by the injustices heaped on top of them finally starts fighting back. It's great. It's really satisfying. By the way, give us the title of the Mendelssohn book just so that our listeners can go and pick it up if they are interested in Diana Wynne Jones scholarship.
Absolutely, which you definitely should. It is called Diana Wynne Jones, The Fantastic Tradition in Children's Literature by Farah Mendelssohn, which was published in 2006.
Yep, do pick that up if you get the chance. So, there's an American lens you can use to examine North and South Walemark. There is an Irish lens, but we were talking about it, and I went, what if
you blew my mind with this.
What if we're both wrong? So, I will use my superpowers as a person who lives here. Wales, the country of Wales, is divided into North Wales and South Wales. In the United Kingdom, if you're talking about the Dales, you were talking about Wales. Wynne Jones, as is obvious from her name, she's a Jones, she was the daughter of a Welsh father. She did not describe herself as Welsh, and there's a, in the same way that I wouldn't describe myself as Irish, despite having an Irish mother, because cultural identity is complex and made of where you grew up. So in her personal essays and reflections, Jones describes the experience of visiting her grandfather in Wales as a child and being the little English girl in a Welsh village and not even being able to talk to the other children because, of course, they spoke Welsh and she didn't. And that awesome Welsh grandfather, who was a famous Methodist preacher, appears several times in her books if you're looking out for him.
Yes, all of the members of her family appear several times in her books, so we're going to talk about that.
But one thing that really sort of jumped out at me once I started thinking in terms of North and South Wales is that North Wales is rural, green, beautiful. There are more Welsh speakers in South Wales because South Wales is where the population is, but you're more likely to actually encounter people using Welsh in day-to-day life in the North because there's more of a concentration of Welsh speech there. Whereas South Wales is more urban, more populated, more prosperous, has the cities of Cardiff and Swansea. So I thought, well, what if Delmark is Wales?
Walemark.
Well, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. But then I actually went, wait a second, but she's got all this English. She's got this word mark in the centre of her book, the centre of her country, the marches, the borders. And Diana Wynne-Jones, English daughter of a Welsh father, has that sort of border in her own thoughts, if you like, or in her own experiences as being an outsider in a Welsh village, but also in some way perhaps an outsider in England.
And there's the myth of the lost king, which again, I never thought about in terms of Arthuriana until you pointed this out. But then as soon as you said it, it's like, right, Moral's name is literally Osfameron to Nammerlin.
Right, so I went, what if instead, if we want to sort of put real world lenses on this fantasy world, which is obviously all of these things and none of them, but what if we imagine that North Delmark is Wales and South Delmark is England? This prosperous mercantile place, this more heavily armed place. South Delmark has guns, the North does not. Mm-hmm. This cold and unfriendly place, and Lenina becomes this cold English aristocrat as opposed to Clennan's sort of expansive warmth, which Moral always thinks of as a northern quality.
Oh my gosh, can we talk about Lenina though?
Yes, we can, and we shall. But read in that way, Delmark seems to be almost a metaphor for two parts of Jones's own heritage and history. And given that the main character, Moral, throughout the book struggles with being a divided person, a person in two halves, is what his father's dying words to him is. He tells Moral he's in two halves and he needs to bring them together somehow. Yes. I wondered if the two halves of Delmark were speaking as well to the fairly common United Kingdom experience of having pieces of yourself from all over the place. A united kingdom, but also a divided kingdom, very much.
Yeah, absolutely. And Moral is a very divided character. And a divided character doesn't like to think of himself that way. I mean, he does think of himself that way frequently, but he, at least at the beginning of the book, as you said, identifies himself so much more with Clennan and with the big, expansive, idealized North where everyone is equal and everyone talks freely to each other. But we do learn, if Clennan is sort of the representative of the North here, we do learn that that's something of a pretense, or at least perhaps not the entire truth, and nothing that Clennan does or says is the entire truth. I mean, it's always all the truth, and it's always all a little bit of a lie. He's always putting on a show. And we also learn through Clennan's relationship with Lenina, do we want to tell the story of how Clennan and Lenina met?
I think it's important to understanding these characters.
Yeah. So Clennan, tells a story early on, which we learn that he's told hundreds of times, which is, I think, a very familiar experience that anyone has with their parents, of them telling the same story hundreds of times. Of when he met Lenina, which was he was hired to play at her wedding. She was an aristocratic Southerner. She was about to marry the Earl Ganner, who Clennan makes a point of getting his name consistently wrong as part of the joke of the story. And he saw Lenina, decided that he was in love with her at first sight, and played the big Cwidder for her, the big magic Cwidder that when you play it expresses truths, changes the minds of people around you, causes them to do things they might not otherwise do. At this point in the story,
I don't think Moral believes that the Cwidder is magic. He thinks of it as just a Cwidder. And indeed, yes. Clennan does reveal that actually this is the only time he's ever able to use the magic in the Cwidder.
Yes, is to make Lenina fall in love with him. He plays for Lenina. He asks Lenina in a song if she'll marry him instead. He meets her afterwards. She says yes. And then he plays a very, very clever trick on Earl Ganner. Ganner says, "How can I reward you for your wonderful playing?" He says, "Give me what you have in your hand," which is, of course, he's holding Lenina's hand, and off and away they go. And what becomes increasingly clear over the rest of the book is that Lenina is miserable ever after this. Clennan tells the story over and over again, and Lenina is silent in the way that she's always silent. And things always almost come to a head that night. They're passing by Earl Ganner's, the turnoff to Earl Ganner's house. And Clennan says, feeling the tension build, feeling that Lenina is even more silent than usual, he kind of dares her to leave if she wants. And there's a really fraught, charged moment that makes all the children really uncomfortable. And then Lenina says, Clennon, you're an idiot. And everyone laughs except Lenina, and things go on as normal. Until Clennon dies.
It is totally clear that Lenina is still miserable. She's not staying with Clennon for love. And in fact, this did make me think of Dog's Body as well. This idea of like this sexual passion, this immediate romantic love as something without much lasting power, without much force to it. Like beyond that magical moment, that first night, Lenina and Clennon are not well matched. And she is very, very unhappy to be living in a cart. She is very, very unhappy to be working against the South for Clennon. Remember, she's a Southern aristocrat, and she is working to undermine the power of the Southern aristocrats. She's unhappy to have her children brought up in a life where they never wear shoes, and where at one point Brid gets a new pair of boots after Lenina marries Ganner and finally goes back to her old life. She gets good clothes for her children. And then Brid won't wear them because she might spoil them.
Right, they're too nice.
She's right, so this life of poverty and hard work and risk, they're taking a huge risk, taking their children with them every time they travel to the South on, essentially, a destabilizing revolutionary mission. They've got their 11-year-old in the back as they're passing out messages that would get them all hanged. And this is terrifying. I think for any mother would be horrified at this.
And I think to go back a second to the Dog's Body comparison, which I think is really apt, because in a lot of ways, and one of the things that I sort of regret not saying on our Dog's Body episode is that when you look at Dog's Body from the point of view of the companion who is sort of shackled to Sirius, we might get a very different book. And I think Lenina is in many ways, I think, a mirror of the companion. She's also described as very pale and very cold in the same way that the companion is. But unlike the sort of partner, mother, evil mother figures in Dog's Body, Lenina is a good mother. She does her duty. She says,
she's honorable. She's honorable. That's her main characteristic. She is very, very, very honorable. Even when she is having a horrible time, she does what she said she would do.
And she takes care of the kids. She says, I've gone barefoot and I've learned to cook and make music. I've lived in a cart on all weathers and never complained. I've mended and cleaned and looked after you all. There were things your father did that I didn't agree with at all, but I never argued with him or crossed him. She is doing her best, more, I think, than I would do in that situation. And her concept of duty, I think, is probably it's not my concept of duty. But she's doing her concept of duty, and she is taking care of the kids. She is, parenting these kids in the best way that she knows how, despite the fact that she's deeply unhappy doing it.
I gotta say, if I was about to marry someone very well off that I loved, and I was carted off by magic by someone who lived in a cart, I would be furious.
Yeah, absolutely.
Forever. And this is interesting because I think it's actually quite rare in Jones's books for the narrative to show any sympathy to this cold, unfeeling mother figure. And Lenina's deep unhappiness is so seldom acknowledged. I think the companion must have been very unhappy with Sirius because he sounds like a real pain to live with.
Yeah, and because we get to see Lenina after she does change her life and go back to what she was used to, we suddenly see her laughing. She's talkative. She's having fun. She's happy with her life again. And over the course of the book, Moral at first is deeply resentful. How could she go and do this immediately after his father was dead? But increasingly over the course of the book, well, first he talks to Dagner, who is much more like Lenina than Moral is. And Dagner would have been probably quite happy staying with Lenina and with Ganner if it weren't for his responsibility to get Kjellin up north. And by talking with Dagner and having these conversations, Moral is sort of increasingly able to appreciate how unhappy his mother was, how loyal she'd been, and what her own particular virtues were that he'd sort of taken for granted.
Right. And I think this kind of brings us to what we've been calling, when we talked about it, the myth of Diana. So Diana Wynne Jones wrote a lot of books in her life, 33 books that we are planning to read through. And in all of them, she says this openly in her essays, she put slices of real people. So, for example, the family that David goes to live with in 8 Days of Luke is a family that Jones lived with briefly for a term before there was room for her in a boarding house at her boarding school.
Right. It's incredibly funny because I think she says, I don't think any of them ever recognize that I put them in. And then you get her son at the very end of Reflections going, yes, of course I recognized myself immediately. I think she was really annoyed at me at that point.
Right. And I actually think it must have been a little bit unnerving, alarming, a little bit risky to talk Diana Wynne Jones, and God knows, maybe you'll end up in her next book.
Uh-huh.
But one figure that appears over and over in Jones's work is the companion, is Duffy. I think she is one of these as well. Is this cold, unfeeling, sexually powerful, abusive mother.
And unhappy.
And
very unhappy always.
So unhappy. And it is fair to say that all of these are slices, pieces, portraits of Diana Wynne Jones's own mother.
Just as the very sort of charismatic, performative father figure who's putting out his charm in various ways, who's always putting on a little bit of a pretense, does have a fair number of echoes of the way Diana describes her own father.
Absolutely. It's tricky to I don't want to turn our conversations into armchair psychology, but sometimes it's hard to avoid it, because with Diana Wynne Jones, it does kind of feel that she was so fucked up about her childhood, she wrote 33 books to process it, and did not process
it. Never, not once. But if she ever comes... I was going to say, if she ever processes it, I think it almost feels like she comes closest here at the very beginning, where she's able to say, look how unhappy Lenina was.
This is the kindest she ever is to the Lenina figure. And actually, I mean, I felt very moved by it. I felt deeply sorry for Lenina and her honor and her misery. But in terms of sort of the myth of Diana, I think the reason we called it that was because it's from an essay by her son, Colin Burrows, who talked about the fusion of the completely ordinary and the completely magical was entirely typical of my mother's way of writing. It was also how she looked at reality. Normality could never just be normality. So if she got caught in traffic on the M25, it was not because it's one of the busiest roads in Europe, it's because she had her own particular travel jinx. And this idea of the mythologizing of Jones's own life constantly coming through in her work, you can kind of feel the annoyance there in that line. I think this must be actually quite difficult to have as a trait for your mother to have. At least
and in a way, you said, I think right before we logged on, you were like, oh, Diana Wynne Jones is Clennon, which is true. I think you can see her in a lot of characters in this book, including in all the siblings, but definitely she's also Clennon.
Right, she's the performer. But I think above all she's moral, but we'll come back to that. Or maybe we'll talk about it now. No, I wanted to just speaking about Jones's parents and the way she describes them. So they were both teachers. Honoria Jones, brilliant name, very Welsh name. Honoria Jones seems to have been this huge, expansive, magical personality, and his wife was a very, very clever woman who did not, on the whole, wish to spend her life cooking and cleaning for this man, who didn't enjoy motherhood. That seems to have been very clear. She was not a happy mother. And the two of them together ran an educational institution in a weird little village. And the way Jones describes her childhood is that she was parentified. She and her younger sisters lived in a shack at the back of the garden. She had to stay up all night looking after her sisters when they were ill because her parents wouldn't do anything. You can see anger bleeding through when she writes about it.
Absolutely.
But interestingly, again, going back to her son's remarks on the story, says, well, that's not how my aunts remember it. And of course, the younger siblings in a family with a parentified elders do experience their parents differently.
100%. And we've seen that come up, this idea of the parentified eldest, the parentified child, as we've said, it's in Ogre Downstairs, it's in Dog's Body, it's here again to a certain extent in Dalemark, but it's here in Dalemark because the parents are gone for reasons that are outside of their control to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think in this one, Clennon and Lenina are less out and out culpable than, say, the parental figures in Dog's Body or in 8 Days of Luke.
Yes.
Clennon and Lenina both have other concerns, other things they care about, and good and important things that they care about. Like Clennan's desire to fight for the values of the North is something Moral agrees with. But it does
Right.
mean that, like, he loses his father. His father is murdered one morning next to a lake when he's slightly drunk, and Moral is just left to stagger on as best he can, carrying his father's huge bass Cwidder.
Right, and then he loses his mother. Although he spends, he even from the first part when basically they run away. They run away on the morning of Lenina's wedding, and he spends a lot of the book thinking, "Did my mother abandon me, or did I abandon her? Have we? Which of us did wrong by the other?" And sort of comes to the conclusion that he is the one who abandoned her because he couldn't bring himself to live in the way that she wanted him to live.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of this is part of Moral's existence in two halves, I think, the way he's torn between his mother and his father. Much more drawn to his father, perhaps, but perhaps also aware that his mother is much more worthy of sympathy.
Yes. And that sort of gives us a backwards view on Clennon, who is this idealized figure, as perhaps slightly less idealized than he looks through Moral's eyes. They're both complicated people, but whole and interesting people in a way that's hard to see when you're their child.
Yeah, that's it, exactly. And where is there's a bit where Moral is thinking about how he and his siblings all are different parts of their parents. He had to admit he had deserted Lenina. He had gone off and left her when she had been trying to make them happy. And going off like that, he'd been trying to deny the southern part of him, all the strict, honourable things which were the good aspect of the South. It did not do to deny them, even though he had only been doing it out of loyalty to Clennon. Clennon was all performance. So that's not quite the bit I was thinking of, but I do think it's relevant to what we're saying here because it's all part of Moral's sort of divided self.
Yeah. And it's also part of the divided self. Do we want to talk about the different siblings and the way they experience art? Because that also ties
Yes.
in with that sort of divided self. All of the siblings are artists, but all of
Yeah.
them are different kinds of artists.
And it's very much a book about art, creation, performance. So, sort of starting with the family show, which Clennon runs entirely his own way. And it becomes clear later on that actually Clennon has almost been holding his children back from finding their full potential by insisting on doing the show his way, even though his way is very good.
Right.
So to begin with, the family musical performance is Clennon does a great big loud booming voice. Clennon tells the stories. Clennon calls out what they're doing next. He is he's the ringmaster as well as the star performer. He puts Dagner on for a little bit to perform his own compositions, then pulls him off again. He puts Brid on to sing, then pulls her off again. He gets Moral to perform some of the what are called the old songs, which are revealed as
Yes.
the compositions from centuries ago by the
But Moral
legendary.
plays background. Moral doesn't do solos.
Right.
He does it. He does it as in conversation with his father, as a partner to his father. But unlike Dagner and Brid, he doesn't get put on the stage to sing by himself.
Right. He's the youngest and he's not ready. Or perhaps he's not being allowed to be ready. So the old songs are supposedly the work of this legendary musician, Osfameron. And Moral is actually named after him. His full name
Definitely
is
not Merlin.
Yep, Tanner Moral Osfameron. And in one of the stories Clennon tells early on in the book, we hear the tale of how Osfameron used his magic to call the dead back to life, the Adon, the heir to Delmark's crown, and then to make the mountains move to create a border between the south and the north. And Moral is deeply interested in these stories, and he's constantly thinking about how different his own dull, ordinary, everyday life
Yeah.
is to the world of myth and story that Osfameron inhabits. But when he performs Osfameron's songs, he does not like them. And I am going to pull one of these out because it really jumped out at me.
Yeah.
Um, so, the first verse of Osfameron's song we hear quite early in the book. The Adon's hall was open. Through it, swallows darted. The soul flies through life. Osfameron in his mind's eye knew it. The bird's life is not the man's life. And this is what I was saying earlier about the English influences on this book. This is out of Venerable Bede, because this is the famous image of the life of the pagan soul being like a swallow flying through a lighted hall. that minute of existence and then gone. So that is the first verse, and we get that, and then it's not until quite a lot later in the book that when Moral's performing that we actually hear the second verse of the song. So at first Osfameron brings up this idea of life as a flash that's then gone again, but then Osfameron walks in the eye of his mind. The blackbird flew there. He would not let the blackbird's song go by. His mind's life can keep the bird there. This is Jones's original poetry here, and that's actually not something she does very much. But that verse, to me, seems to read as about the power of art to create immortality, a lasting power, something that stands sort of outside the immediate, the normal, the if you like, the doomed everyday life. Swallow dies the minute it leaves the hall. Osfameron keeps the blackbird's song in his mind, and so keeps it alive.
Yeah, and there's something about the way that Moral is he loves the myths, but he doesn't want to perform them directly as they are. He doesn't enjoy performing the old songs in the old style. Midway through, when he gets, he has to go on stage for the first time on his own, and he's able to he puts on the song in a different way. He does a different kind of performance.
Not yet being expert, and not anyway liking the noise the old fingering made, he found he had been unconsciously modifying it into a style which was not old, not new, but different. Osfameron's jerky rhythms became smoother, and Moral felt that if he could have spared time to attend to them, he might almost have understood the words.
Yeah, and this is so reminiscent of the way that Diana Wynne-Jones herself, in her essays about pulling old myths into contemporary stories, talks about the need to make those stories contemporary in order to get through to children. She can't, she talks about story time and how story time is always the present time. She doesn't want to write Arthuriana that's set in the age of Arthur or about knights in shining armor. She doesn't want to write a Norse myth story that's set in, old Norway. She wants to set it now in the present so that she can put her own particular present day slant on it and pull out what's still relevant contemporarily.
Right, and what really comes out as you reach the end of the book is that Moral has spent his whole time thinking, oh, everything's gone so ordinary in Walemark nowadays. Nobody is going around making mountains move. And then at the climax of the book, Moral makes the mountains move using the power of the Cwidder. Also, he discovers that he is Osfameron, that Cialan, who he's been transporting north this whole time, is the Aedon, because that is always the title of the heir of this northern earl.
And his sister Brid is also Menalia Brid, who's this other legendary figure.
So actually, he's been living in myth the whole time. That what he thought was ordinary, everyday, boring life was always deeply mythic. And this brings me to the moment when Moral encounters Cialan's father at last and shows him the magical Cwidder. And the Earl says, I used to think Clenham was boasting when he said it was Osfameron's, but I wasn't much of a hand at the old writing in those days. His square, practical-looking finger pointed to a line of swirls and dots made of slivers of mother of pearl. Here it says, I sing for Osfameron. And there, his finger moved to another line of signs, it says, I move in more than one world.
Yeah.
That, I think, is the killer line for this book. It's moving in more than one world. Moving in both the everyday world and the mythic world, because they come closer and become the same thing. Moving in both the world of the north and the south in Walemark. Moving between the two halves of who Moral is. That is how you create art with power.
You could almost say it's now here and also nowhere.
Hey, that's jumping ahead. But yeah, you're right.
And one thing, so we've talked about Dagner, who's the oldest sibling, who makes new songs, which is the thing that Moral thinks he can't do. And Dagner is also the only one of the siblings whose name does not show up in any of the myths. Like, Dagner also has a long name. It's Diasgadlin Hen Dagner, which presumably comes from some other story. But he's not part of the myth of the Aedon and Osfameron and Menalia Brid. He writes new songs. He's not interpreting the old songs. And he gets arrested and packed off in the middle of the story. He can't be allowed to continue. He's not part of this myth as much as he's doing something new and interesting and contemporary. That's not what the book is doing.
Right, because the book is about retreading the myths and making them new. And there is, in fact, the moment when Moral realizes, or in fact fails to realize, even as he's doing it, that he is composing something new. So his final performance at the end of the book, they are running for the north, running for the fortress that guards the northern border, just ahead of the first line of the southern invasion, created by the actual villain of the book, who we barely mentioned.
Right.
He's not very important, is the thing. He doesn't actually do
No.
very much. It's so much a sort of tight and close family drama. But the actual
Well,
villain of
he's
the book,
mostly important as part of the family drama because he's Lenina's cousin.
right? One of the things that Moral is uncomfortable about is the similarities between him and Lenina, and therefore between him and Moral himself.
Uh-huh.
Right. So they are running for the border ahead of Earl Tholian's invading army. And they are only just going to make it. And this is the point at which Moral is finally understanding what he can do with the power of the Cwidder. So he performs a marching song which makes it seem as if there are far more northern soldiers than there actually are. But even that isn't enough. And they make it just to the border, and then the horse, Olob,
We haven't mentioned the horse either. The horse that Moral loves, who's been their guide throughout this whole book.
Right, and this Olob is genuinely a major character from the first page. It's the family's very sensible, intelligent horse who has a nose for a good campsite, a nose for danger, and when you live in a cart, your horse matters. And Moral in particular feels a real closeness to this horse. And this actually, I think, does remind again of Dog's Body and this closeness between children and animals, both of whom are sort of victims of whatever the adults around them are doing and can't really exercise much control. And there are multiple scenes in this book where Olob is like, we're in trouble, we need to leave. And the various humans do not listen, and then something happens.
If they'd only listened to Olob, none of this book would have happened.
True. Absolutely true. But anyway, so at this sort of final desperate escape from the invading southern army, Olob panics because he's surrounded by soldiers and shouting and confusion, and this is a lot for any horse.
Very sensible thing to do in that situation, honestly.
Yeah, he rears, and by sheer bad luck, a stray bullet from the southern army goes through the horse's head, and the horse is killed. And the big brown body falls down at Moral's feet. And that is when Moral loses his temper. He says, that does it. He's lost his father, he's lost his mother, he's lost his older brother, and now they've killed his horse. And this is the point at which Moral climbs up the hill. So he doesn't go into the fort, he climbs up on the hill so he can see the whole invading army, and he starts to play the Cwidder, and he performs something new that is his own. He doesn't realise that it's new and his own as he's performing it because it's too important just to perform it as it is. And it's something that's true. And that's what he's realised about the Cwidder, is that its power comes from telling the truth. The power of art, if you like, comes from telling the truth.
And it's sort of the truth, but it's not quite the truth. He sings at the end, the magic spell is he speaks all the horrible things that have happened to them. He speaks of the injustices that have happened to Kialan and Conian. He talks about the murder of his father. He talks about the arrest of his brother and the war. He doesn't talk about the horse.
Right, when it's all about the horse. So he in fact, later he feels guilty about this. He thinks he's cheated the Cwidder, that actually if you use art to tell a truth that isn't the whole truth, it's going to come back for you. It's going to get you some way. I love the poem. Again, Jones is writing in her own words, but this is Anglo-Saxon alliterative poetry, so it's like, Kialan and Conian were caught in a storm. The one you hanged in Holand had not harmed anyone, nor had Kialan when you caught him. This is for Conian first. Unlucky Clennon lies by a lake in Markind. The singer you stabbed on suspicion only and prevented him performing. This is for the porter, Clennon. There was no mercy shown by the magistrate in Neathdale to Dastgandl and Handagna. There was death in the south and weeping in the uplands. Now war comes north, and all through Tholian. This is for Tholian. She knows what she's doing. That's
absolutely does.
She has such fun with language in this book. She doesn't usually get to do the Tolkien thing of writing her own poetry.
Yeah, and she's really, really enjoying herself. Moral's not enjoying himself. Moral sings the song, and then the mountains come down and crush numerous people. Moral's body count is higher than anybody else's in Diana and Jones so far.
Right. So Moral literally does what his ancestor, the wizard Osfameron, did centuries before, and uses magic to make the mountains move, create a new border between north and south, and he crushes this invading army so that Olob has company in death. And it is pretty spectacular and pretty horrible. And Moral immediately afterwards says, I just did something awful, didn't I? And bursts into tears. Because he did.
Absolutely. He knows, he feels the power of what he's done, and he knows deeply, profoundly that he did it because he was sad about his horse.
But I think, although Moral himself feels that he's done something wrong, I don't know that the narrative agrees with him. I think this is a book about, again, injustices happening to children.
Mm-hmm.
And the breaking point that children will eventually reach after enough injustice is heaped on them.
Yes.
I think the book has deep sympathy for Moral's break, for Moral's
100%.
misery. And it's weird because, okay, I think if Walemark was written today, contemporary genre would be trying to make it a YA book. So they couldn't you age them all up a bit? And trying to make it more of a high fantasy book. So couldn't it be a bit more of the politics, the drama, the world building? Can we see a bit more of that? But instead it's a very, very... The word I keep coming back to is simple. It's a very simple story. It's a very tightly focused story. It's just these children on their cart with the Cwidder. There's the title. I do hate that title. I do think it's bad. I don't know what I do instead, but I don't like it. But it's this very, very simple and focused story about a child who loses everything, becoming more and more unhappy. And then, like, one step to the left, a fantasy drama is happening, worthy of any YA story. You could make Kialan the hero. You could make Brid the heroine. And in fact, Jones's editor tried to encourage her for book 2 to write a book about Brid. And Jones just refused. Book 2 is much more interesting than that.
Yes, I'm very excited to get there, which we will in just a couple of episodes.
We will. But Cart and Cwidder is so... I'm trying to find the word. It's simple. It's beautifully simple. It is about the suffering of this one child and the enormous consequences of that suffering expressed through art.
And it's not, I think it's really important to say, it's not a classic hero's journey. It's not, it's been compared to Tolkien, and we've compared it a bit to Tolkien, but it's not really a Tolkien kind of fantasy.
Not at all, no. On a language level, yes, but on a storytelling level, no, that's not what she's doing at all.
Yes, and it's not a coming-of-age story. I'm going to go back to the Mendelssohn book again, which says, I think quite rightly, that Jones refuses to allow epiphanies, like Moral's realization that he's in two halves, to form passages into adulthood. Adulthood is not wondrous. It's not a YA. It's not about Moral going through these experiences and coming out as an adult. The end of the book is that Moral goes off into another apprenticeship. He's going to leave and go off and learn, with another singer to do what he loves best, which is continue traveling between the North and South. Neither is the right place for him.
Fascinating, because Moral spends the whole book daydreaming of the North, but the North he imagines, a sort of green, warm place where he walks under rowan trees, doesn't exist. When we finally see the North, they arrive at Hanart, which Moral has always longed to go to. It's a big, bustling city.
Yeah.
It's a lovely city. It's a friendly place. He likes it there. The culture suits him better than the South. But it's not what he dreamed of. This sort of mythic place in his mind doesn't exist in either of the real Dalemarks. It is another world, if you like, a mythic world.
And when he dreams of it at various points, which he does during the first part of the book, the magical Cwidder makes a sort of awful, muzzy, out-of-tune sound, because the Cwidder knows that the North that he's imagining is not the truth, and it's not even the kind of part truth or adapted truth that he uses at the end. It's not the kind of artistic half-truth. It's just nostalgia for a place that doesn't exist.
Art has to be true to have power. That's what keeps coming out of this to me. But that is, and then Moral chooses to leave this character who's in two halves. Clennon tells him he's got to bring his two halves, his divided self, together to find his power, actually Morrill goes on being divided. He doesn't belong in the south. He gets north and finds he doesn't belong in the north either. He is still a person of two worlds, a person also of like this mythic art world and the real world, a traveler, an outsider wherever he goes, and he stays that way. And he chooses to leave alongside the singer Hestefan rather than try to make a life for himself in the north.
Yeah, Clennon is wrong, and Clennon is wrong several times in this book. I think the one true thing that the villain, Tholian, says, at one point he says to Morrill, never try to carry on like your father. It's stupid and it never pays. If I'd copied my father, I wouldn't be here with an army. Now, we don't want Tholian to be here with an army, but so much of this book is about the children of Clennon attempting to copy Clennon in their various ways and failing because none of them are quite like Clennon and none of them can immediately step into Clennon's shoes and become him. And trying to do that undoes them one by one until Morrill at last has to completely reject his father's advice in order to come into his own power.
Right. You can't be your father. You can only be yourself. And there is, I've lost the quote, but there's a moment when Morrill thinks he's going to have to find out who he is and then do it that way. But he doesn't know yet. And you're right, it's not YA. He doesn't find out by the end. He does unlock the magical power of the Cwidder, but it's not really a happy moment.
He's scared of it. He's
terrified, as he should be, because he has, again, this is a very, very high body count for an 11-year-old.
Yeah. I think we should say, by the way, though, that the body count, while we're thoroughly spoiling the book, in the end, the body count does not include Dagner. Dagner ends up fine.
Yeah, that's very important to me. Dagner is fine. Dagner is, in fact, the Earl, the new Earl, because Tholion died and all his heirs died, and only Dagner's left. They're distant cousins.
This is one of the actual genuine points of comedy in the book. He turns out, he's like, hey, guess what? I'm the new Earl. Nothing will possess them to have me. But he also Dagner is rescued by Lenina and Lenina's new husband off screen.
So Lenina's choice of going to her first love, going to the life of power that she was born for, going to a southern aristocrat, is what saves Dagner. Yes. Because within the world of the South, to get him out of that prison, you need that power. And Lenina's choice to embrace that power is the only reason Dagner survives.
And Lenina's
is this so much more sympathetic to this cold mother figure than she ever is elsewhere. And Lenina sends a letter at the end. She sends a letter to her children up north.
It's so sad.
It's really heartbreaking. So first Dagner says, well, she heard that the mountains moved and said, oh, they must have got north then. So there's that awareness that Lenina does actually understand something about Morrill that no one else did. Lenina hears the mountains have moved and goes, that must have been Morrill. So there is this understanding of his power and his magical abilities that no one else knows about.
Right.
But also Lenina sends the letter and describes how happy she is, and the life she's having, and the wonderful time she's having with Ganner, and everything she's up to, and this beautiful country she's living in, which is, of course, the country of her childhood. And Brid is very moved and says, what a lovely letter, I'll keep it forever. And Morrill says it could have come from a distant acquaintance.
Right. There's this way in which, again, Morrill is the one who abandoned Lenina. Lenina hasn't abandoned Morrill. She hears what he's done and understands him instantly. She's his mother. But he's 11. And even though he's come to this point of understanding the parts of himself that are like Lenina, he uses that at the end when they're trying to get away from Tholian. And he sort of unlocks this very cool, calm, southern, intellectual, unemotional part of him.
I'll tell you what it is. It's the part where Morrill thinks that he is a better liar than either of his siblings because he can keep that cool head. And this is in no way like self-criticism on Morrill's part. Lying at this point would save them. And being
he's
a really expert liar, I think actually to me it is reminiscent of the character of Luke in 8 Days of Luke. Morrill, of course, is another character who is a young boy with red hair and a vague and dreamy expression.
The high body count.
Terrible magic, capable of terrible things, and able to lie. We're not officially doing Jones's short story, Carol Ear's 100th Dream. And if we were, we wouldn't be doing it yet because it was written a lot later. But that is a story about reusing characters in your art. And I think Jones might have reused this one.
Yeah, that's another connection I never would have thought to make until you pointed it out, but I think you're 100% right. But then, despite the fact that he's able to access the parts of himself that are like Lenina and value them, at the end he still can't make that connection to her. We, the reader, are able to see all the ways in which she can connect to him. But he reads the letter, and it's like it could have been written from anybody.
Right. That divided self is never resolved, and in fact almost can't be resolved if Moral is to go on being who he is, the artist he wants to be.
Yeah.
Shall we call it there?
Let's call it there. Thank you guys for listening once again. If you've got, we now have our podcast is up on various platforms. You can subscribe to it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you'd like to. And if you have questions or thoughts for us, you can email us at 8daysofdiana@gmail.com. And next week we'll be doing Power of Three. Is that right?
Yeah, it's Power of Three next, and then into Drowned Ammon and Charmed Life.
Yes.
God, the late 70s are good. I'm really excited for these ones.
Me too.
All right.
All right.
See you next week.
See you next week.